Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. During the Easter season, we always seem to see them, and that's why we thought it would be good today to focus a little time and attention on how to answer all of the allegations and all of the myths surrounding Jesus. You, for example, will sometimes see these posts in internet, blogs, and other places, maybe even on your Facebook, that argue that Jesus did not exist. Maybe you saw the Zeitgeist movie done by Bill Maher, who, by the way, is a comedian, not a historian. Or you can see some of the individuals, and there have been lots of those posts recently, suggesting that the whole story about Jesus was borrowed from Egyptian pagan myths, Greek pagan myths. And so we felt that it would be really appropriate to try to answer some of those questions that tend to circulate around the internet, and maybe give you some opportunity then to answer those, either in the conversations you have with individuals, or maybe some of the posts that you might post as well. And a lot of this can be found in a book that has been written in the past by Dr. Phil Fernandes, who will be our guest today, but also recently he delivered a paper at the International Society of Christian Apologetics, which this year was held just a few miles away from this studio, entitled "Did Jesus Really Exist? Refuting the Jesus Myth Hypothesis." If you're not familiar, also serves as a senior pastor for Trinity Bible Fellowship, and as well has been teaching Bible, philosophy, and world religions at Crosspoint Academy and the Gateway School of Ministry, all of those in Bremerton, Washington. Matter of fact, both of our guests these next 2 hours are from the Seattle area. And Dr. Phil Fernandes, welcome back to Point of View.
Oh, it's great to be on with you there, Kerby.
I really appreciate the work that you've done over the years, and I've got in front of me here the paper that you delivered, but of course I have your book, Hijacking the Historical Jesus, Answering Recent Attacks on the Jesus of the Bible, and we have some links to your website. But let's get into this a little bit, because you know as well as I do that if you go to some of the movies that are out there, like that one I mentioned a minute ago, the Zeitgeist movie, or you see some of these books, Did Jesus Exist? Or the question about the Christ myth theology. Sadly, a number of individuals on the internet, and even some of these kids we're sending off to college, are going to run into this. And the answer to that is pretty simple, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really sad, because it's based on outdated New Testament scholarship. I mean, this was a popular view in the late 1800s and the early 1900s from the History of Religion school, where they tried to claim that everything about Christianity was not unique; it was borrowed from pagan myths, and it's been pretty well discredited. The evidence is, the more we learn about the pagan myths and the more we learn about the New Testament, the less they have in common. So it's kind of an embarrassment in scholarly circles. In fact, Bart Ehrman, probably the leading anti-Christian scholar out there when it comes to New Testament studies, not exactly our ally, but Bart Ehrman wrote a book, Did Jesus Exist? And he makes a very strong case that Jesus of Nazareth did exist, and he argues that the internet atheist ought to just drop the issue, because they're losing all credibility in scholarly circles. And they'll say things like, well, nobody wrote about him while he was still alive, and Bart Ehrman says, well, what's your point? In ancient times, you never wrote about a guy until after he died. You assessed his life, and then if there was somebody that was interested enough to do the research and write about his life, they did it. But the evidence for Jesus of Nazareth and his life and death by crucifixion even a liberal scholar like Bart Ehrman acknowledges that's just historical fact.
And that is kind of interesting because it may be one of the few times on this program that you will hear us agreeing with Bart Ehrman because, as many of our listeners are well aware, many times we talk about how he has tried to discredit and undermine our credibility in the New Testament. So when I say even Bart Ehrman thinks this is a really bad idea, but also in your paper you mentioned somebody else which I was not as familiar with, but I began to look at it a little bit more. Maurice Casey is an agnostic, kind of really almost calls himself an atheist, but he also is an individual that, to put it mildly, could not sign the doctrinal statement of our church or some part of that. But at the same time, really argues against these individuals that say that Jesus is a myth because they are trying to date the Gospels very, very late. And so this has been kind of this idea that you have the Jesus of history, but then later, after the myth and legend developed, you have the Christ of faith. But we have pretty good evidence now, better all the time, that the Gospels are written down during the time that the eyewitnesses who were there, also during the time in which the skeptics could have refuted it. True?
Yeah, and it's really interesting, too, because Maurice Casey is obviously not a conservative scholar, doesn't believe Jesus is God incarnate, doesn't believe he died and bodily rose from the dead. Yet here's a New Testament scholar. Now, he died a few years ago, but his research led him to believe that Mark's Gospel was written in 40 A.D. and Matthew's Gospel from 50 to 60 A.D. So, I mean, it's amazing that there are some anti-Christian scholars that make their life studying the New Testament, and it's amazing how much they will actually give us. But he gives us even earlier dates for some of these Gospels than some of our evangelical pastors hold to. And but he's Casey, much like Bart Ehrman, they're very, very embarrassed that people of their worldview would take a view so historically non-credible that Jesus of Nazareth either never existed or he existed but lived a normal life, and all the stories of the miracles and things of that sort were borrowed from pagan myths. The evidence goes against that, and that's why the Jesus myth hypothesis died in the early 1900s.
Let me, just before we take a break, and when we come back, we want to talk about some of the arguments that, the story of Jesus is borrowed from pagans. But one more point. We have the Gospels. We have the book of Acts. We have the epistles. We have all sorts of things. You have really some of the early creeds in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. But even if you were to throw all that out, you have Jewish historians like Josephus, Roman historians like Tacitus and Pliny the Younger. That's enough to help you establish that Jesus was a historical person, isn't it?
Yeah, my old professor at Liberty University, Dr. Gary Habermas, he wrote a work, The Historical Jesus, and he shows how many facts of the life of Jesus you can build in just one of his chapters in that book, just based on secular, non-Christian ancient writers within 150 years of Jesus' life, and you pretty much get an entire outline of the gospel message. So now I believe it's Dr. Norman Geisler and Frank Turek, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. They even state that there's 42 different authors that mention Jesus' name within 150 years of his death, whereas the Roman emperor that day, Tiberius, you only have 10 authors who mention his name within 150 years of his death. So the evidence for the historicity of the Gospels and of the life of Christ is just overwhelming.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, what about the argument of myths that the Egyptian god Horus was born of a virgin on the 25th day and was a teacher, was crucified and buried in a tomb, or Mithras was born and had disciples? And what about all this? Did Christianity borrow from those pagan myths? I think you'll hear some very good answers to that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, whenever there's a mass shooting, we read headlines or hear commentators describe it as a random shooting. While it is true that many times the victims are chosen at random, the locations for their carnage are rarely random. When Dr. John Lott was on my radio program, I asked him about this because I'd heard that the shooter at Aurora, Colorado's movie theater bypassed many other theaters and venues because those locations had security. John Lott said that the diary of the killer, James Holm, explained his selection. He decided not to attack the Denver airport because he wrote that it had a substantial amount of security. Then out of 7 theaters within 20 minutes of the shooter's apartment, Holmes went to the only theater that banned concealed handguns. John Lott gave another example from the church shooting in Charleston, South Carolina. The shooter, Dylan Roof, originally planned to go to the College of Charleston, but he changed his plans after realizing the school had armed guards. While drinking at someone's house, Roof blurted out his plan to carry out a mass shooting at the College of Charleston. The person who heard the comment said, "I don't think the church was his primary target because he told us he was going for the school." The person at the party concluded that because Roof couldn't get into the school, he settled for the church. So if gun-free zones seem to make people more vulnerable to shooters, is there anything that might reduce the likelihood of a mass shooting? John Lott and Bill Landis, in a scholarly research paper, gathered more than 20 years of data on mass public shootings. They studied the impact of gun control laws, and none of these laws had an impact on shootings except one. They concluded that the only law that had a statistically significant impact on mass public shootings was the passage of right-to-carry laws. Our elected officials need to consider these facts if they want to keep people in their communities safe. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Phil Fernandes. By the way, if you'd like to join us at any point during this first hour, you can give us a call at 1-800-351-1212. At the moment, talking about first the Jesus myth. Now I want to move to another one, and that is, did Christianity borrow from some of these pagan myths and ideas? And for those of you that are watching online, you'll notice I'm holding up a book right now called The Gospel and the Greeks. This was a book that at Probe Ministries we published 25 years ago. And Dr. Phil Fernandes, if nothing else, it did my heart good to see you quote from this book that we worked so hard on when we got our good friend Dr. Ronald Nash to write it, because he makes, I think, a very compelling case that indeed the Christian story and the story about Jesus is unique, and it is not borrowed from all of these pagan myths, even if you see some of these memes that are starting to show up on various internet websites right now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that Ronald Nash's work, the late Ronald Nash, brilliant scholar, I would go so far to argue that just about maybe Edwin Yamauchi has some really original things to say, but for the most part, evangelical thinkers like myself, it's just a footnote on the work of Ronald Nash. He set the table for us, and so it's an amazing book. It should be in every Christian's library. Ronald Nash, The Gospel and the Greeks. So I'm really, really glad to hear that you had a part in putting that back in print.
Yeah, well, again, it's a pro book, and it's been around for 25 years. And you certainly did a good job there. And of course, you mentioned a few of the others, Scaling the Secular City.
Yeah.
And both Ron Nash and J.P. Moreland, who we're quoting from, actually indeed have been on this program, but we have you on at the moment. And again, let me hold up your book again, Hijacking the Historic Jesus, because what a great book that you co-authored with Kyle Larson. Let's get into this a little bit, because just to help people understand, before we went to the break, I gave you just a few examples. I have one here, and this is a printout I used in one of my presentations recently, saying that the Greek well, we'll take the Egyptian god first. Let's take the Egyptian god Horus. Was born of a virgin. His birth was announced by a star in the east. He was a child teacher. He had 12 disciples. He walked on water. He was crucified, buried in a tomb, and resurrected. He was called the Way, the Truth, and the Light. And he was a fisher and associated with the Lamb. Now, if you just read that, you go, whoa.
Yeah.
Almost all of the story of Jesus seems to be there. Now, let me take one more just to get the point on the table here. Mithras, okay, we'll go to a Greek god here, born December 25th. Great teacher, traveled with a master, had 12 disciples, was buried in a tomb. After 3 days, he rose again, was resurrected. He was called the Good Shepherd, the Way, the Truth. And a lot of people look at this and go, well, I didn't know that. I guess this was all borrowed from the Bible. Well, it turns out all of that is wrong, but nevertheless, if people go and land on some of these websites, or if they have a teacher in Religion 101, they think that maybe I shouldn't trust the Bible because they may have borrowed from some of these Egyptian or Greek myths. How do we think through this?
Yeah, and it's really interesting, too, because it sounds so powerful, and the parallels just seem to be off the charts, but in reality, even Bart Ehrman and Maurice Casey, the two non-Christian scholars that we talked about, it basically acknowledged that there's no unambiguous evidence whatsoever of any pagan dying and rising gods before Christianity. And the same could be said as for the virgin birth as well. So anytime that these ancient pagan myths, many of these pagan myths predate Christianity, but anytime they start having these parallels with Christianity, it's for two reasons. Number one, it's way after Christianity has been established, so that maybe they're borrowing from, if borrowing occurred, it was from the pagan myths, borrowing from Christianity,
right,
to try to compete with this growing religion. And then the other factor is, you can describe an ancient pagan religion in a way that the ancient pagans never described their own religion, by using Christian terminology,
yes,
so that it sounds like there's these real parallels, when in reality, you could tell any story and just, talk about, use phrases like born again and sacrificial meal and salvation. You could just start throwing in a whole bunch of terms and really make it look like you have parallels that are saying almost exactly the same thing, and borrowing must have occurred. Now, another thing I would say, too, is besides the fact that the pagan myths are really just based on seasonal cycles, not history and all, but even when you do have real parallels, Mark Foreman out of Liberty University wrote a paper, and when part of the paper dealing with this, in the Kennedy assassination and the Lincoln assassination, the
yes,
parallels there are off the charts.
Mm-hmm.
Yet Kennedy really was assassinated. It wasn't based on the Lincoln myth, and Kennedy assassination wasn't a myth. Greg Koukl, another great apologist from Southern California,
sure,
in his most recent book, he mentions about this book, I think it was called Futility, this novel written in 1898 about this large ship, a cruiser ship called the
Titan, yeah,
the Titan,
yes,
yeah,
yes,
and it hits an iceberg.
It's like the Titanic, yeah,
and it sounds blow by blow description of the Titanic, which didn't occur for another 15 years later. So we're going to say, okay, the sinking of the Titanic never happened because we found parallels in a novel, written 15 years earlier, or 10 years earlier. So even if there are some parallels, that shouldn't cause us to worry. But the fact of the matter is, most of these parallels are just in the imagination of the people who are writing. Now, we'll say this: church leaders, Christian leaders, did begin to borrow a little bit from pagan myths.
True.
After Emperor Constantine converted. But that's a whole different discussion there. That's where the emperor professes faith in Christ, and now he's trying to figure, how can I convert my people who are pagans to Christianity? So he took a pagan celebration on December 25th, made it the celebration of Christ's birth, and different things like that. So that kind of borrowing occurred much, much later and had nothing to do with the origin of Christianity. The origin of Christianity, the Jews, the early church were ancient Jews. They got the foundation for their belief system from the Jewish Old Testament and from real historical events that occurred in the life of Jesus.
Very good point. And I wanted to point that out somewhere along the line, so I'm glad you did, because some people might say, yeah, but didn't Christianity sometimes borrow from the pagans? Yes, no doubt about that. As a matter of fact, we've talked about that on the program and can get into that a little bit later if you want. That's not the same issue as this, and that is we certainly, if anything, have very good evidence that some of the unique aspects of the life of Jesus, his birth, his death, his resurrection, only later were maybe attributed to others. And just before we go to the break, let me just use one more example that you used, and that is you said that sometimes people read into it. They use Christian terminology to look at an Egyptian or a Greek or Babylonian myth. And I thought the best example I could come up with would be the Egyptian god Osiris. According to the myth, was murdered and then dismembered, and the pieces were scattered. But then later, according to the myth, the pieces were collected and reassembled, yet one piece was missing, and becomes a powerful god in the underworld. Well, this is not a resurrection in any shape, manner, or form, but if you use a resurrection kind of motif on top of it, you can see how some people might say, well, that kind of looks like a resurrection. That's not exactly the story we tell about Jesus, but it is something where, again, sometimes you have to make sure you don't put your 21st century view of Christianity on something that was found in the pagan world.
Yeah, and the Resurrection of the Son of God by N.T. Wright, he dedicates over 100 pages to arguing the fact that among all the pagan religions, there was no expectation of a bodily resurrection, no belief in a bodily resurrection. The whole goal, which was they originally got from Plato, was for the soul to escape the confines of the body. So they weren't even desiring a bodily resurrection. It was a concept that they laughed at. When Paul preached at Mars Hill, he was laughed at. Once they found out that when he used the word anastasis, he wasn't talking about a deity. He was talking about Jesus' bodily resurrection. Once he came to that point, he was mocked by most of the Greek philosophers in the crowd. And so this idea that, the pagans were talking about bodily resurrections for centuries before Christianity came on the scene. No, that was considered an embarrassing aspect of early Christianity, was the fact that they had to preach the bodily resurrection of the Lord Jesus to a people who found that intellectually beneath them.
Well, let's take a break, and those of you that have ever traveled with us when we've gone to our Israel and Greek trips know that you've actually had a chance to stand right there in Mars Hill and see where Paul actually preached that, and as we pointed out, the reaction from those pagans listening to this idea of resurrection. We're going to continue our conversation, but this last half hour, let me open up the phones. Perhaps you have some other questions about Jesus and the Bible. This book, Hijacking the Historical Jesus, Answering Recent Attacks on Jesus of the Bible, is a book that I would highly recommend. We also have a link to some of the material that is available from Phil Fernandes at his Institute of Biblical Defense. So feel free to go to the website, pointofview.net. That will provide you with a link. And when we come back, we'd love to take some of your phone calls. If you'd like to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212.
What difference does it make when you support Point of View? For Lee Weaver and his family, it meant doing something to reach out to women in need, and so far, to help bring nearly 5,000 babies into the world.
As a family, we were sitting around the dinner table. Our older daughter said, "Dad, we need to do something about it." And that kind of struck a chord in our family. All of that started out of Point of View and the effect it had on our conversations and our heart, leading us into don't be hearers only, but doers of the word. Point of View has always been real supporters of the concept that we're a small part of.
Your support of Point of View inspires people to do great things. You partner in spreading truth around the world. But the only way to make that happen is for you to make the call or visit us online and join the Truth Team. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Do it now. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us, the rest of this hour, Dr. Phil Fernandes, president of the Institute of Biblical Defense. And if you'd like to join our conversation, let's open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get into some other aspects of defending the Gospels and defending the Bible and really being able to make a very cogent and coherent presentation of the gospel to our friends, neighbors, and coworkers. But just before we do so, Dr. Phil Fernandes, we have a link to the Institute of Biblical Defense. You can type in instituteofbiblicaldefense.com or just follow the link. And I might just mention that we even have another link on the website there so that people can find out a little bit more about this particular issue of pagans borrowing from Christianity versus vice versa. But let's, if we can, talk about what's available on your website and also your availability to go and speak. I know you've done a number of debates over the years, and this would be something that churches could do to draw out their unsaved friends. Nothing draws people to a debate faster than a debate about Jesus or the Bible or something like that. I know you've done rather well in some of those debates over the years, haven't you?
Oh yeah, they've been a lot of fun, and I teach full time at a Christian high school, so I don't really pursue the stuff, but I do get phone calls, and if I can, and emails, and if I can squeeze a debate in during the school years, I'd rather speak during the summer, to be honest with you, but if I'm able to squeeze it into my schedule, then so I've debated at Princeton, at Chapel Hill campus, I've debated at Washington State University and State University of New York, the Oswego campus, and so it's been a good ride, and I've been taking debates since about 1997. I had debated Dr. Michael Martin over the internet. At that point, he was the leading philosophical atheist at the time, philosophy professor from Boston University. So yeah, I do speaking engagements when I can fit it into my schedule, and we just ask that expenses are covered, and then if people want to listen to my lectures online or watch my debates, and
right.
They could just go to the website and click on the sermon audio button, and if they want to buy my books, they could just look them at Amazon.com. Just make sure you spell Fernandes with an S. It ends with an S, not with a Z. And but yeah, we just try to be available to do whatever it takes to train people in the defense of the faith, and at times take debates and things of that sort.
Well, let's, if we can, get into a couple other aspects of things that you talk about in Hijacking the Historical Jesus, which relates back to this issue of paganism. And that is, Phil, there are probably some people say, well, I don't know that I've run into too many people that doubt whether Jesus existed, or too many people that I run into that believe that the Bible borrowed from pagan myths, although I tend to run into some of those. But I bet a lot of people run into individuals that wonder whether the Bible is reliable. And one of the things you even point out is that when you look at these pagan myths, there is a very long gap between the original recording of that myth and any copy that we have. In some cases, a long gap from when it happened and the first recording. And that is very different than the Bible. So for just a minute, when we look at the pagan myths, let's compare them to the Bible. What do we find?
Well, we find several things, and one of the things is that the pagan myths were written in such a way that you knew they were writing mythology. C.S. Lewis points that out, that it was all based on the seasonal cycles and nature dying in the fall and the winter, and then coming back to life in the spring, and they were cyclical stories, and so basically just trying to borrow from nature and explain things. They won't give you who the reigning king was and who the governor was, and the genealogy of these supposed gods and things of that sort. And so C.S. Lewis pointed out that after he became a Christian, he looked back and he thought, you know what, I'm an expert in classics, and I know mythology when I read it. How come when I used to read the Gospels, I used to classify them as mythology when they're not even written in the genre of mythology? They're written as if the authors claimed to be eyewitnesses or no eyewitnesses of these events, and recorded it as historical data. But with all of ancient literature, even when it's historical literature or philosophical literature, you don't find anything from the 1st century A.D. that even comes close to the New Testament. The New Testament, we have some copies. Now there are scholars arguing for copies that are actually in the 1st century, fragments that have been recently found and things of that sort. And but everybody would agree that the John Rylands fragment dates to about at least 125 A.D. although there are some that were dated much earlier than that, and that's a fragment from John's Gospel, chapter 18. We've got almost 6,000 copies, ancient copies, handwritten copies in the Greek, the original language. All the handwritten copies, when you include Old Latin and Latin and the other languages that the Bible was translated into, you have over 26,000 copies. So, Homer's Iliad, I think last count it's up around 1,000 at this point, but it's again, the New Testament 26-1 outnumbers second place. More times than not, you'll be lucky to get one or two copies anywhere from 600 to 1,000 years after the original was supposedly written, and that's good. That's good evidence, except when you deal with the New Testament, because there's this bias, this anti-supernaturalistic bias against the biblical writings.
Well, again, let's just think about this. If somebody is in college and they study Plato's Republic, you have a gap of almost 1,300 years, and you have, according to your book, 7 copies. We just mentioned a minute ago Tacitus. He is a Roman historian. I don't know anybody that would question what we know about Rome and question what we know from Tacitus, but there's a gap of over 1,000 years. The first copy we have is more than 1,000 years after he wrote it. We have 20 copies of that. I mentioned Pliny just a minute ago. Only have 7 copies there. So obviously when you took number 2, that is Homer's Iliad, is the best of the secular writings.
Yeah.
But compared to the Bible, it still fails terribly or falls short, whatever word you want to use. But when you go to the New Testament, like you said, 25,000, 26,000 copies written during the life and the time of not only the eyewitnesses, but the skeptics. And that means something, doesn't it? Because somewhere along the line, if for example, Luke writes the Gospel of Luke and he writes Acts, makes a mistake, you're going to hear about that. And for a long time, you've even had some of these modern scholars question Luke, but the more we do archaeology, the better he looks, right?
Yeah, and it's, you get, I think Colin Hemmer did some really good work on that, showing the historical reliability of the book of Acts and the Gospel of Luke. But when you go to the enemies of Christianity, like, Justin Martyr and his dialogues with Trypho, a Jewish lawyer, Trypho never once questioned that Jesus of Nazareth actually existed. When you go to the Jewish Talmud, the Jewish oral commentary on the Old Testament law, that was placed in written form, they refer to Jesus as a sorcerer who was leading people astray. So they acknowledged there was a supernatural aspect, a supernatural element to his life. And then the Talmud even refers to Jesus as being illegitimate, which seems to imply that it was common knowledge that Joseph was not Jesus' biological dad. And so it's amazing when you look at the non-Christian writers, they all acknowledge that he existed, and they acknowledge an awful lot of things that the early church taught, so that we know that this teaching goes back to the earliest days. In fact, the ancient creeds and hymns, and even the ancient sermons of Acts chapters 1 through 12 that are quoted in the book of Acts and in Paul's writings, these ancient creeds and hymns, they go back to the early 30s A.D., the earliest days of Christianity. So there's not even any time for legend to develop. The creed of 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, which Paul quotes in about 55 A.D. when he's writing to the Corinthians, even the Jesus Seminar members Marcus Borg and Gerd Ludman actually date that creed, which gives a summary list of the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus to his disciples, to Peter, to James, the half-brother of Jesus, and then Paul adds his own account, and then a visit of Jesus to over 500 people at one time. Well, Gerd Ludman and Marcus Borg of the Jesus Seminar acknowledge that they actually think that Paul received that creed when he got baptized in Damascus, after his road to Damascus experience where Jesus appeared to him alive. And so they actually date that creed to being formulated within 1 year of Jesus' crucifixion.
Wow.
So there's no time whatsoever for legends to even develop. This is just reporting the data almost immediately after it occurred.
Let's take a break. When we come back, you mentioned the Jesus Seminar. I want to talk about that for just a minute. Again, as a listener, you may say, well, I've never heard of that. Well, you've read it because it showed up in Newsweek. Matter of fact, just a few days ago, you had CNN put out a piece on the myths of the cross. So we'll get into that and see if we can answer a few more questions and give you some intellectual ammunition. But we need to take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Phil Fernandes right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Even truck drivers deserve religious liberty. That may be the clear lesson from a case recently filed by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. J.C. Witherspoon Jr. Inc. hired Leroy Lawson in 2012. His job was to drive truck from the company's South Carolina facility. During his pre-hire interview, Lawson informed the truck supervisor that as a Hebrew Pentecostal for 35 years, he observes a religious Sabbath from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. During that time, he explained, he is not permitted to engage in any labor. Just weeks after his hire, the company mandated that all drivers work on Saturdays. Lawson complied, but at the end of his shift, he informed his supervisor that that day's labor would be the last he worked on his Sabbath ever again. Thankfully, his company accommodated his faith until December of 2013 when they asked him to violate the observance of his Sabbath by working. Lawson refused and was promptly terminated. Lynette Barnes, the regional EEOC attorney handling the case, put it well in a press release. Under federal law, employers have an obligation to endeavor to fairly balance an employee's right to practice his or her religion and the operation of the company. Much of life requires that we make compromises. Federal law and the Constitution suggest that an employee's religion should never be one of them. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Phil Fernandes with us for just a few more minutes, and if you'd like to join us, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. Founder and president of the Institute of Biblical Defense, and again, I would encourage you to go to the website and find out a little bit more. In his book, Hijacking the Historical Jesus, Answering Recent Attacks on the Jesus of the Bible, you do have a short chapter on the Jesus Seminar, and since you mentioned it, Phil, I thought we'd get into that. And for the listeners, let me just say that some of you are going to say, I've never heard of the Jesus Seminar, but you've read about it because, as I mentioned, you can pull up a Time or a Newsweek. You can sometimes watch some of these PBS specials. The other day, CNN had, of course, a piece on myths about the cross. And the Jesus Seminar was led, and you mentioned just a minute ago, by Dr. Marcus Borg until he died. And matter of fact, I've gotten to know him because I moderated a debate between him and William Lane Craig and Darrell Bach and some other individuals. And the argument of a Marcus Borg or John Dominic Croissant or some of the others is just what I was saying a minute ago, that we have the Jesus in history. There was a Jesus, but there has been myth and legends surrounding him. He didn't walk on water. He didn't turn water into wine. He didn't heal people. These were added later, and that, frankly, they even doubt whether some of the various sayings attributed to Jesus were really said by him. So help us out for just a minute, because most people maybe have never heard of the Jesus Seminar. But unfortunately, if they read some of the things written by religion editors or various individuals that are scholars that are quoted in newspapers, news magazine articles, internet websites, or on television, they're actually getting a pretty good dose of some of this idea of the Jesus Seminar, aren't they?
Yeah, it's kind of the Jesus Seminar itself. I don't believe they still gather anymore to take votes on Jesus' sayings. After that, they did it on the events of his life. They published the 5 Gospels, where they kind of demoted Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to the level of the Gnostic heretical Gospel of Thomas, and so they call it the 5 Gospels, and they just put in red the things that Jesus definitely said. Well, I could have paid for the red ink. There was so little red ink in there, but whatever the case, these guys are working off the assumption. I think we evangelical scholars need to be a little careful about trusting in too much of what New Testament critics are saying. And I think we need to take a second look at the early church fathers, because I think we would come up with much earlier dates for the Gospels and all. But what these guys are doing is they're trying to kind of argue from silence that Jesus died approximately 30 A.D., and the first writings start with the Apostle Paul about 50 A.D., so you got a 20-year gap, and then the Gospels are written a little later, and so you got a 20-year gap. And so what they're saying is the Gospel was preached orally during this 20-year gap, and that's where legends started to develop. And then you get the full-blown Jesus story by the time they're writing down. So it's no longer trying to date like John's Gospel to 250 A.D. You can't do it. We've got copies of John's Gospel that predate that.
Yes.
Everybody acknowledges John's Gospel had to be written at the latest between 90 and 110 A.D. I agree with James Charlesworth out of Princeton that you could actually date John's Gospel to the mid-50s A.D., but whatever the case, now that we've got to accept earlier dates of the New Testament books than the old liberal critics used to date them, now what they're doing, they're putting all their eggs in the basket of, okay, during that 20 years when nothing was written, let's try to figure out what actually happened. But this is all based on a bias, a presupposition that miracles are impossible.
Right.
If you assume miracles are impossible, then the Jesus of the Bible cannot be the Jesus of history, and that's why they're constantly trying to search for the true Jesus of history, because they deny miracles. But in the end, whenever scholars do that, they always create a Jesus in their own image, and that's what's gone on with the Jesus Seminar, and so. But in reality, when we look at that 20 years, now I think that there was a lot of writing going on during that period, but I'm in the minority even among evangelical scholars. My chapter on redating the New Testament and hijacking the historical Jesus will document that. And I get my information primarily from the early church fathers. But even if you had that 20-year period, we do know some of that oral tradition. The early primitive sermons of Acts chapters 1 through 12, the ancient creeds that we find. And so just from looking at these ancient creeds, which go right back to the 30s A.D. and the ancient sermons, the earliest sermons of the Christian church, you have Jesus who is acknowledged as the Lord, as Yahweh. He is acknowledged as the Messiah. He is acknowledged as the Savior of mankind who died on the cross for our sins and who bodily rose from the dead. So you can get that. Again, Gary Habermas's work, The Historical Jesus, he'll build a case just on the creeds and this ancient sermons that predate the writing of the New Testament, and you still get the same Jesus, the same supernatural Jesus that we get in our New Testament today.
Well said. Again, if you'd like some more information, we have a link to the website, instituteofbiblicaldefense.com. You don't have to even write it all out. We have a nice link there, as well as information about Dr. Phil Fernandes. Let me encourage you to go there and to find some of his articles, to watch some of the videos that he has there, some of the teaching, which I think would be very helpful. And if nothing else, I wanted to do this because I recognize that we are living in a time in which there really will be more and more attacks on the Bible. And so I really count as a good friend those individuals that have been part of the International Society of Christian Apologetics that do this area of helping us know how to defend the Christian faith. And over the last couple of weeks, you've seen some stuff about whether Jesus was a myth, whether or not their various testimony of Jesus was borrowed from pagan writers, whether or not we have too much time between the event and the first recording for a myth and legend to grow up. And I think we've given you some very good answers. And this is where you're going to need to turn as you see some of these attacks, and especially if you have young people going off to college and they want to get around many of their friends, or they want to take a Religion 101 course. They're going to hear some of this. So, Dr. Phil Fernandes, thank you very much for at the International Society of Christian Apologetics, and we look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you so much, Kerby. It's always an honor to be on with you. God bless you, man.
Book, again, is entitled Hijacking the Historic Jesus. And again, if you want more information, he could even give you that paper, Did Jesus Really Exist? Refuting the Jesus Myth Hypothesis. So go to his website and find that information. In the second hour, Dr. Diane Medved is going to be with us. Don't Divorce is her new book. You might remember her earlier book, The Case Against Divorce. So we're going to talk about some very practical aspects of marriage and family. But just before we do, let me also encourage you to go to the website. You can find some of the links that we've been talking about today. We have an action item, a video for you to watch, but most importantly, let me encourage you for just a minute to click on that banner that says Join the Truth Team, because if you've appreciated some of the intellectual and spiritual and biblical information we've given you today to help you deal with some of the attacks on Jesus, attacks on the Bible, I hope that you'll consider what you might do to support this ministry. A one-time gift would be greatly appreciated, but I've also challenged some of you to consider what you might do to join us at $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year, and that is certainly something that would be very helpful to us. Rebuilding truth in a post-truth culture, and as we've begun to see some of the attacks on the Bible and Jesus, we really do live in that post-truth culture, so we're trying to provide you with the kind of information and encouragement and really to equip you to make a difference in the culture and certainly to begin to proclaim the gospel. So let me again encourage you to visit the website, pointofview.net. Sometimes you like to talk to someone, and you could do that. The pledge line number is a different number than the one I've just given. It is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. If you'd like to make a pledge by calling on the phone. We come back, we're going to talk with Dr. Diane Medved. Don't Divorce, Powerful Arguments for Saving and Revitalizing Your Marriage.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
As I mentioned last hour, we're going to spend some time now talking about the subject of divorce. And in previous programs that we've done on divorce, you know that oftentimes I quote from a book that was written in 1989, which had this startling statement, and that is, the author said, "I have to start with a confession. This isn't the book I set out to write. I plan to write something more consistent with my professional experience, helping people with decision making." She goes on to eventually say, "To my utter befuddlement, the extensive research I conducted for this book brought me to one inescapable and irrefutable conclusion. I had been wrong." The title of the book was The Case Against Divorce. It was written, of course, many years ago by Dr. Diane Medved, and I am just thrilled that she has this new book out, Don't Divorce: Powerful Arguments for Saving and Revitalizing Your Marriage. She has a Ph.D., a clinical psychologist, columnist for USA Today, author of 5 previous books, including the one I just mentioned, and an individual that, as you probably gathered, is married to talk show host Michael Medved, who's been on the program with us before, and like our previous guest in the first hour, also lives in the Seattle area. Dr. Diane Medved, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
My pleasure, Kerby.
Fascinating, because I so appreciate that you've updated some of the material. But let's go back to 1989, because even when you wrote that book, that was like a stop sign in the midst of a fast freeway, because by that time we had everything from no-fault divorce laws and general acceptance of divorce, and except for maybe, I don't know, Judith Reisman, a few other people, you were one of the few that said, wait a minute, this is not as good as you think it is. It turns out that divorce is harmful to the individual, it's harmful to the family, and we have pretty good studies even back in 1989 to demonstrate that.
Yeah, and it's gotten worse since then, because now we're seeing the effects on the second generation. In 1981, which was the peak year, but that's really all they had. Then a few years later, there were some longitudinal studies that said, yeah, we're kind of demonstrating that these kids aren't so great afterward. But now, here we have a whole second generation, and we're finding that the age of first marriage has climbed significantly, largely because of the children of divorce who are afraid to make a commitment and don't want to repeat for their children what they had to endure.
Yeah, the median age for first... And also the whole definition of marriage is changing. Of course, you talk about that briefly. We're going to move mostly to divorce, but I think it's important to mention that when you have the redefinition of marriage, first because of divorce, cohabitation, now same-sex marriage, I think a lot of young people really are thinking twice before they enter into a marriage covenant, aren't they?
Well, they certainly are, because marriage becomes less attractive. I mean, many people look forward only to divorce. And they say, if that's going to be inevitable, why should I do this at all? Which is destabilizing our whole culture. Because if you don't have marriage, you don't have the groundwork for children being raised in stability and in security. And what does that do? Well, it messes with each of their minds, and it also changes the whole basis on which we interact and continue politically and personally in every way.
Again, this book is entitled Don't Divorce: Powerful Arguments for Saving and Revitalizing Your Marriage. It's published by Regnery, and we have information about the book and about Dr. Diane Medved on our website, so you can follow some of those links there, dianemedved.com, and you can certainly find it there, as well as information about this book. Probably one you'll find in your local bookstore, but if not, we've made it very easy for you to find. Well, let's, if we can, Diane, for just a few minutes, get into what you call the divorce magnets. The first one is, an enticingly permissive type of culture. And that one, coupled with your second one, sex is everywhere, are some reasons why sometimes divorce is seen as a very viable option, and also maybe explains why a lot of individuals decide to just live together rather than get married in the first place.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, because it doesn't seem that you need to get married to have sex or even to have kids. So people figure, well, why should I make a commitment that's going to be so difficult to get out of if I don't need to? I can just, they used to say, why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free? That's such an outdated phrase, but really that's the way people are thinking. Why should I have to set myself up for all this legal mess when I don't have to, and I'm not being stigmatized at all anymore for it?
In my Christian ethics chapters, I have one on divorce, one on cohabitation, but the one on cohabitation is always, well, you've heard this before, you wouldn't buy a car without a test drive, you wouldn't buy a pair of shoes without trying them on, but of course I like to say, if you decide not to buy the car, you don't leave your belongings in the trunk of the car, you don't hurt the feelings of the car. This isn't a really good analogy, but sadly, you have individuals that are postponing first marriage, or if they live together before they get married, now I'm quoting from, a number of other research studies as well, Barbara Defo Whitehead and some people like that, you're increasing the likelihood of divorce. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised that the divorce rate has gone up, simply because we seem to be doing various things in personal relationships and the culture that make divorce a little more likely than it was just, say, a generation ago.
Absolutely. In fact, the studies that you quote show that there's an actual 33% increase in likelihood of breaking up if you live together first. And that shows a mindset of not complete commitment. In other words, if you're willing to try it out and say, well, maybe this won't work, then that is a way that you look at a relationship. And that carries through when you do decide to get married. Maybe this won't work. There's always divorce. And now more and more people at their wedding are admitting that they're thinking, well, I love this person. I foresee it working out, but if it doesn't, well, it's no big deal.
This book, almost 400 pages, just covers so many different aspects of divorce. We'll do our best in this hour to cover those. But one other divorce magnet, just before we take our first break, workplace priority and proximity. That is something, because you have the two sexes together more than ever before. You have the priority of work. Then you have, if I can add the internet into that, we went from adultery to online affairs, and went from maybe having pornography available in some seedy section of town, now available at a mouse click. So there are just a lot of things in our culture in the 21st century that, again, have actually fed into the possibility of couples getting divorced, haven't we?
Absolutely, Kerby. You mentioned something very important to a lot of people, and that is the prevalence of porn. It is so easy for people to be distracted by that, and it is a phenomenon that has gotten very little coverage, and yet it has so many people addicted in secret. And when a husband, and it's typically the man, finds such easy and ready alternatives for his feelings, his outlets, what that does is pull him away from his spouse, because he knows that she doesn't like that. How many marriages does it really help to have the husband involved in porn? And now we have our phones. They're smartphones, but they're also dumb in terms of how we spend our attention. And what people are doing are now even accessing porn on their phones. Wherever they go, they can go out for a lunch break and have an access session. And those kinds of things then create divisions in terms of how husbands and wives confide in each other. They don't talk about that. No husband wants to go on and on about the porn that he's looking at. And yet the accessibility, it's just normal among people under 30 nowadays for men to be accessing that all the time. So that is a really big factor. And then you mentioned workplace proximity. It isn't just the fact that men and women are together. It's also the fact, and I don't think we can ever put the toothpaste back in the tube on this one, women and men, everybody should, of course, fulfill their greatest potential. But if that's in the workplace, what that does is take your time and your attention away from your marriage. In other words, if you're trying to compete in a big market, you're not going to have time for all the outings and family time you once did.
We'll take a break and continue our conversation with Dr. Diane Medved right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, whenever there's a mass shooting, we read headlines or hear commentators describe it as a random shooting. While it is true that many times the victims are chosen at random, the locations for their carnage are rarely random. When Dr. John Lott was on my radio program, I asked him about this because I'd heard that the shooter at Aurora, Colorado's movie theater bypassed many other theaters and venues because those locations had security. John Lott said that the diary of the killer, James Holm, explained his selection. He decided not to attack the Denver airport because he wrote that it had a substantial amount of security. Then out of 7 theaters within 20 minutes of the shooter's apartment, Holmes went to the only theater that banned concealed handguns. John Lott gave another example from the church shooting in Charleston, South Carolina. The shooter, Dylan Roof, originally planned to go to the College of Charleston, but he changed his plans after realizing the school had armed guards. While drinking at someone's house, Roof blurted out his plan to carry out a mass shooting at the College of Charleston. The person who heard the comment said, "I don't think the church was his primary target because he told us he was going for the school." The person at the party concluded that because Roof couldn't get into the school, he settled for the church. So if gun-free zones seem to make people more vulnerable to shooters, is there anything that might reduce the likelihood of a mass shooting? John Lott and Bill Landis, in a scholarly research paper, gathered more than 20 years of data on mass public shootings. They studied the impact of gun control laws, and none of these laws had an impact on shootings except one. They concluded that the only law that had a statistically significant impact on mass public shootings was the passage of right-to-carry laws. Our elected officials need to consider these facts if they want to keep people in their communities safe. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Diane Medved is with us today. Her book is entitled Don't Divorce, Powerful Arguments for Saving and Revitalizing Your Marriage. Broken down into 4 sections: Beware the Perils of Marriage, and we'll stay on that for just a little bit longer. Then Why Not Divorce? Reasons to Avoid a Split. Section 3, All the Wrong Reasons, Answering the Arguments for Divorce. And then finally, Fixing a Hole, Why You Should Stay Married. And again, Diane, I know, might as well issue this disclaimer now. We recognize that there is never an option, but in a society that today has made divorce very easy with no-fault divorce, I know even working with pastors, sometimes teaching in a seminar, I've had pastors tell me, you know, it's just really difficult to do marriage counseling anymore because if the two partners aren't quite with me or they aren't committed to the marriage, today you can get divorced for any reason or no reason at all. So all you have is one individual say, I'm out, and that's the end of the counseling session. So there are some things to think about individually and maybe even as a society about trying to turn around what you call the divorce momentum.
Absolutely. It seems in our culture that people are not taking marriage seriously. Who you marry and what goes on in your marriage is the most important area of anyone's life. Nobody looks back and wants to put on their tombstone, I gave my all to work, I had 3 wonderful families. No. The kind of goals that people have is to be successful in a loving relationship that lasts till you die, to raise children who are not only functional but thriving. And that can only be accomplished when commitment is honored. And that is the problem. What I had to do, the reason I had to write this book was because there's been a sea change in values. And people used to do their duty, you know, the greatest generation We moved from that to the Disney mantra, which is follow your heart. And if marriages are only based on feelings, then those feelings can go, and there's no basis for continuing or fighting for the relationship.
Let's talk about one of the sea changes. You talk about that in one of your chapters about the danger of detaching marriage from parenthood. And I recognize that not every married couple has children because of all sorts of choices or even infertility. But you get married to have children, to carry on a family, to carry on a society. And we have so disconnected sex and child rearing that today we need to come back and see that those connections are very important, don't we?
Absolutely. What I say is that people should, when they get married, especially in a first marriage, I understand that there are a lot of second and third marriages where families are already formed, or they could be couples are older, or it could be that there's infertility. But in the vast majority of cases, when people get married, they need to look forward to this as a family project. In other words, it needs to be a lifetime goal whereby you see your family as the point of getting together, that it's not just you against the world. It's not even just you and your spouse against the world. It's that you can see the significance of your relationship carrying into future generations, and you can understand the importance of that and the significance of that the moment is great, and you do what you can to enhance it, but the long-term goal is significant to yourself, to your family, to your community, and to God. It's got more to it than just having a big party.
Wow. Let's, if we can, talk about some of the reasons not to divorce. And in the past, oftentimes in my Christian ethics book, I'll talk about the 3 E's, the emotional impact, the economic impact, and then even the educational impact on kids. But now I'm going to have to revise this. I'm going to either have to find out another E or change that, because you've got a chapter here on hazardous to your health. And there are 2 huge, and I mean underscore huge, meta-analysis studies, one by the University of Arizona, one by McGill University, which were shocking to me in terms of the fact that when a person says, well, I'm going to get divorced, it's probably better for me. No, actually, if anything, it's worse for your health, isn't it?
Well, it's definitely worse for your physical health, because people who have no spouse, it's an interesting story. My husband, Michael, a couple years ago, unfortunately, we were shocked when he was diagnosed with throat cancer.
Yes.
And I will never forget sitting in the office of the oncologist, and we were there together. We went to our appointments together because this became a project for both of us to get through. And the doctor sat us down and said, to Michael, you're very lucky, because people who have a spouse, someone to care for them, someone to watch over them, someone for whom to get better, have a much better prognosis. And can you imagine being diagnosed with cancer and being alone and having to face the appointments and the pain of it by yourself without someone there who considers you his soulmate or her soulmate? It makes such a huge difference physiologically. And also people, when they get divorced, they tend to let themselves go. You don't really care about how you look as much, except maybe to attract other people, unless you feel that you're important to someone. And so there are many, many physiological issues that come up and benefits to being married.
Well, and one of those that I just thought I'd mention, since I mentioned the word huge, people are going to say, well, why do you say that? Well, the McGill University study covered, and you're ready for this number, 600 million subjects. I mean, that's not a typo. It was 600 million subjects. And the results show that divorced people have a 30% higher chance of dying from all causes than their married or single counterparts. And I think of the book, The Case for Marriage, and some of these other books that have come out over the years. There is a lot to be said about being in a marriage and going through the difficulties of life with a married partner and having somebody nag you. Yeah, that can be a positive, and other things, so that you can actually make sure that you are going to be a healthy person and live a longer life.
Yeah, every time that you're told to put down that cream puff, you're reminded that that other person cares about you.
Yes.
So you've got a double benefit. One is it's good for your health. But secondly, you can see the love in the other person toward you, and that is also a spur to be the best person you can be.
Again, physical health is one of those. As you might imagine, economic health or difficulties. Again, you have in here a longitudinal study which just again shows what takes place. And over the years, I don't think, whether you look at the statistics or the anecdotes, I've known a few individuals that were lawyers that ended up sometimes having to go and deal with divorces. In almost every case, somebody ends up being hurt. And oftentimes I've even noticed that giving to churches or giving to Christian organizations decline because all of a sudden now you have 2 households to support instead of 1. And so there are all sorts of obvious economic implications to divorce, aren't there?
Well, completely. And it isn't just that you need to have 2 houses, which of course means 2 sets of expenses. But in addition, the standard of living, just the quality of life, declines by 50%. It declines by 50%. Now, if you imagine that you're barely making it by while you're married, imagine how it would be if you have far less and you have more tasks that you have to accomplish. You'd have less time to earn money. For example, the idea that you have kids and you have to shuttle them back and forth, and you only get them on certain days, that restricts your choices of how to use that time. That all impacts you financially as well as emotionally. And so you're not even able to earn as much money as you might have thought you could in many cases. And for men, in order to continue earning what they have, in many cases, again, they choose to give custody to the wife. And what does that do to their relationship with their family, their children? So there's all kinds of ruinous ripples that emanate out, not just financially, not just physiologically, but they all end up touching on the emotional.
Well, and again, we'll get into some more of that in just a minute. We need to take a break, but even there, studies found that a majority, more than a majority of children of divorce who kind of stayed in contact with both parents say that they felt like they were growing up in 2 families, not one. So even though they theoretically all have the same last name, they are in different venues. So there are just a lot of very important issues that certainly you need to pay attention to. And if you know individuals that are thinking about getting divorced, this is a book to put in their hands and say, think again, because there are some consequences. And we've learned over the years that these are long-term. Sometimes we thought that they were just a momentary crisis, but kids are resilient. They get over it. If you've ever talked with any adult children to divorce, you know that that continues for much longer. So one of the reasons I really wanted to spend some time today talking about this book with Dr. Diane Medved. Her book is entitled Don't Divorce, Powerful Arguments for Saving and Revitalizing Your Marriage. I would imagine you should be able to find that in most of your bookstores, but we also have information about her on our website, so you can just click on the See More button by her picture there. It will take you to DianeMedved.com. You can get a copy there. Of course, we also have a link as well, and this is material that I really think that you need to have. For those of you that are in the helping professions, maybe you're a counselor, a pastor, maybe you are involved in helping small groups or something like this. This is really a book I think needs to be on your shelf. And so let me encourage you to get a copy of that and to find out a little bit more. Let's take a break. When we come back, I might take a phone call or two. We'll see if you have some comments or questions about this. 1-800-351-1212. But we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the emotional and spiritual impact. What about the impact it has on children? And then, if we can, try to answer some of those, if you will, wrong reasons that are so often given for why divorce is something that a couple should actually pursue. So again, all of this in this new book, Don't Divorce, by Dr. Diane Medved. We'll be back with more right after this.
In an age of fake news, getting good information is vital. Point of View works to bring you that each and every day. But as Diane in Arkansas illustrates, passing that information along, educating others, is something you can help with. Diane is a college professor. She influences the next generation, and she wrote, "Thank you for your informative letter. I used some of your quotes when I was teaching the Declaration of Independence in my literature class." Diane, like so many, hopefully like you, is taking what she received from Point of View in letters, online, through our app, on the air, and rebuilding truth in this post-truth culture. All of that takes a team. Join the Truth Team at Point of View. Find out how you can help at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or sign up online at pointofview.net/team. Show your commitment. Make a difference today, right now. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Diane Medved. The book is entitled Don't Divorce, Powerful Arguments for Saving and Revitalizing Your Marriage, published by Regnery. You probably can find it in your local bookstore, but we have links on our website, pointofview.net. You talk about the fact that it can affect your health, your finances, but another one, which again might surprise some of our listeners, Diane, it also can affect your psyche and really begin to affect your values. How so?
Well, anyone who gets divorced has to recognize that it is a failure. And when people set off on a marriage, they don't want and they don't look toward having that happen. And so what does it do? It means that you have to end up excusing or vilifying certain behaviors that you or your partner have. In many cases, for example, there's a situation where I call it chop and run, where one partner just basically comes home one day and says, I'm out of here, and the other person is left. Well, then how does that person justify or rectify what happened with their life taken away from them? And they start reevaluating their past, and they start seeing flaws in it, and they start thinking about the things that they thought were good that really weren't. And so it's a means toward depression for many people, and for other people it's a means toward justifying behavior that's really inexcusable. So that's just in the lead-up to the divorce. Then when it comes to the divorce itself, it inevitably pits you against one to whom you pledged your life.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, it means that you have to become an adversary to the person with whom you were supposedly combined. Well, that tears everyone's psyche apart because you're then becoming selfish. And when you focus on getting what you can out of a relationship that you tried to build with someone else, that changes your perspective towards everything. It's all me, me, me. It has to be in many cases in order for people to come out financially whole, but they're never whole again. But the point is that you have to diminish your standards for who you are and what you've lived. And that changes you so much. And in many cases, it pulls people away from their spirituality because they're dealing in financial, concrete realities and not in lofty goals that really uplift them. They're sort of dragged into the dregs of unpleasantness and discomfort. And so it does harm you psychologically that way, just to have that in your history, just to go through that. Everyone who's been divorced looks back on the period of time of their divorce with pain, with discomfort, with unease, and that is something that you carry with you at all times. And people who have been divorced may even afterward feel ashamed about it, because if it wasn't especially in the case when it's not their doing, they're carrying this mark that they never wanted to have inflicted on their lives. And so there's many forms of psychological distress and disease that occur because the divorce happens. It isn't even a matter of being happier afterward. Everyone who finishes a divorce should try and be happy, and everyone who goes through it should make lemonade out of lemons. But the process itself and having that in your past and the new relationships that you have to form with people who may not be your friends anymore is very, very difficult.
It certainly is. And again, you wouldn't know that by reading some of the books that I see in the bookstore. Of course, you even mentioned some dispatches from Today's Good Divorce and How to Part Well, or I love this one, When Parents Part, How Mothers and Fathers Can Help Their Children Deal with Separation and Divorce. But it's not anymore a question about the impact that this has on children. We've had some long-term longitudinal studies that show us that the impact that divorce has on the children, even when they are now adult children of divorce, is quite devastating, isn't it?
Well, yes, because there's studies that show that in 2/3 of the cases, the divorce was in a low-conflict home. And those are cases where the children don't realize that their parents are fighting or have problems or are coming apart. And one day the parents sit them down and say to them, okay, Johnny and Susie, we hate to break this to you. We'll always love you. We love you so much, but Mommy doesn't love Daddy anymore, and Daddy doesn't love Mommy anymore, and so we have to live apart. Well, what happens to those kids in the 2/3 of low-conflict families where they thought their home was functioning just fine? They are devastated. Then they question their entire reality, because what they thought was a happy home turns out to be disastrous. And now they have to shape a whole new life, 2 lives for themselves, one for mommy's home and one for daddy's home. And so they are the ones who carry this with them, that reality as they live it is probably not accurate. Imagine taking that with you, that what you see and what you believed isn't reality. So these children have that in their past no matter what. And there's no way to erase that, especially since, for many, the ensuing years of going back and forth are their formative years, the times that they should be treasuring as a childhood that's carefree and preparing for adulthood.
And add to that the fact that some of them think they are the reason that the divorce took place. And so just think about carrying that with you as a kid that's in grade school, middle school, or even high school. Maybe you begin to process that a little better in high school, but again, just think of the impact that has. And one of the other things, I mentioned this earlier, that children are resilient. You have a section there, Children's Resilience, a Ruthless Excuse. Explain that if you might.
Well, this is the thing. People look at themselves and what they're feeling in their relationships, and they're uncomfortable and they want to get out. And then they justify the collateral damage of their children as kids are resilient. Well, no, kids are not resilient. And the truth is that they will survive because they have to. They have no alternative. But children, by definition, are forming the skills that become resilience. They are not practiced in them. They are not able to take situations that change easily. In fact, the most valuable commodity to a child is his security. And I wrote about this in a book with my husband called Saving Childhood. And there are 3 things that kids need. I mean, security, optimism, and a sense of hope. And these 3 things are totally destroyed when parents tell kids, well, you're no longer in any control. We're going to do something that you don't want, and that is break up our home. So kids are feeling very, very much in control, unqualified to do anything. And so the idea of saying, well, they're resilient, it's really a myth. It's impossible. Children can't be resilient because they haven't developed resilience yet. What they can be is survivors, and that's not a good thing.
Certainly not. Again, we've talked about the impact on your health and your finances, on your children, but you also have a section on the ruinous ripples of divorce. And there's a couple of ways that plays itself out in terms of the family structure, even to the grandparents, the friendships. But also, I've said on the air, and I think you probably would agree with me, that one of the greatest predictors for a divorce is a previous divorce. Because if you look at the statistics for divorce of first marriages, compare that to divorces of second marriages or third marriages, the percentage seems to be going up. True?
Well, it's an interesting thing. You do find statistics that show that there is a much higher percentage of second and third marriages that end in divorce. And then you also see a study from England that shows that the divorce rate is the same for second and subsequent marriages. Yeah. So it's hard to say, but I would say that couples that have blended families have a lot more challenges because there are the needs of each individual entering the relationship in the family. It's not just a marriage of 2, where 2 people have to gauge how they're interrelating and combining, but rather how each individual, and that means children who each may have their own special needs and their own developmental tasks and their own needs for attention, they're not only unable to receive that attention, but at the same time they have to then adapt to a whole new set of circumstances that may include siblings they never wanted to have, that may include a whole new set of relatives that are strangers to them, that includes all kinds of social situations in which they're awkward and uncomfortable. So children in blended families have bigger challenges, and parents of those children have a bigger chance for divorce because those tasks are not easily accomplished.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll just try to dip in a little bit to some of the wrong reasons, and then also look at how to, if you will, as it calls it, fixing a hole, and that is to why you should stay married. Again, there is so much in this particular book that we could cover much more in an hour, but we've done the best we can to give you a little bit of an overview and certainly, hopefully, encourage you to get a copy of the book. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the work that Dr. Diane Medved is doing, we have a link to her website. If you'd like to get a copy of the book, as I mentioned before, you'll probably be able to find it in your local bookstore. It's published by Regnery. I expect to see it in all sorts of bookstores, but again, we have a link there as well. The book is entitled Don't Divorce, Powerful Arguments for Saving and Revitalizing Your Marriage. And I thought we'd come back and at least talk about this idea that it's nobody's fault. That's one of the problems that we've had ever since we've had no-fault divorce, that, we don't have to really place any blame. We don't really have to say one person made a mistake. And in this non-judgmental culture, that sounds really good. The problem with it is that then allows you to get divorced for any reason or no reason at all. And as I pointed out just a minute ago, very difficult to bring a marriage together if indeed one of the partners has already decided that he or she would give up. So we'll talk more about that with Dr. Diane Medved, and then we'll come back and get into a few of the positives that we can pull from this book as well. All that coming up right after these messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Even truck drivers deserve religious liberty. That may be the clear lesson from a case recently filed by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. J.C. Witherspoon Jr. Inc. hired Leroy Lawson in 2012. His job was to drive truck from the company's South Carolina facility. During his pre-hire interview, Lawson informed the truck supervisor that as a Hebrew Pentecostal for 35 years, he observes a religious Sabbath from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. During that time, he explained, he is not permitted to engage in any labor. Just weeks after his hire, the company mandated that all drivers work on Saturdays. Lawson complied, but at the end of his shift, he informed his supervisor that that day's labor would be the last he worked on his Sabbath ever again. Thankfully, his company accommodated his faith until December of 2013 when they asked him to violate the observance of his Sabbath by working. Lawson refused and was promptly terminated. Lynette Barnes, the regional EEOC attorney handling the case, put it well in a press release. Under federal law, employers have an obligation to endeavor to fairly balance an employee's right to practice his or her religion and the operation of the company. Much of life requires that we make compromises. Federal law and the Constitution suggest that an employee's religion should never be one of them. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dr. Diane Medved as we talk about her book, Don't Divorce. And Diane, one of the things I appreciate about your book, in addition to all the facts and figures and statistics and studies, is just a lot of really practical material. And in one of the chapters, it's nobody's fault. You talk about, we've grown apart, we weren't well matched, we got married for the wrong reasons, whatever the argument might be. There's just a lot of practical help in this particular book as well. And yet we hear this so often in this non-judgmental culture. We just sort of want to say, well, it's just easier to say it's nobody's fault. That way the kids don't blame one person or the other. But this whole it's nobody's fault mindset was what was at least part behind no-fault divorce, where you can get divorced for any reason or no reason at all. And it seems to me that somewhere along the line we need to say we need to stay together for our health, for the health of our children, and for the stability of society, don't you think?
Well, absolutely. No-fault divorce. They were thinking in the 80s when there were so many divorces that it was clogging up the courts when each side had to try and prove that the other party did something wrong, and it was defaming, and it was depressing, and it was really a difficult situation because there were so many divorces. This had never been a problem until then, though, because divorce was rare, because divorce had a stigma to it, because people were encouraged to stay together, and their friends and relatives would cheer them to work it out. But now it suddenly became that people didn't want to be judgmental, and so whatever your problem is, okay, I don't want to hear about it, so you can just get divorced and go on your way. Very few people realize there are still 6 states that allow fault to be pursued in a divorce. And those states are considered unenlightened because nobody wants to go there. Nobody wants to talk about that. And yet, if we did talk about the fact that just about every marriage can be improved, and 2/3 of marriages don't have to happen. 2/3 of those low-conflict marriages are not the ones with abuse. They're not the ones with abandonment. They're not the ones with addiction. Those are marriages where if the people were willing, they could bridge the gap. Now, it's true, you're right. 1/3 of divorces are necessary. And I know many people whose lives have been saved by such a thing. However, with so many, 2/3 that could be worked out if only the attitude was correct, I think there's a lot of room for improving things rather than pointing fingers or even saying it's nobody's fault, especially nobody's fault, because that is the non-judgmental case that people say, well, we just grew apart. And I think what we need to do is not accept that. When our friends say that, instead of just stepping back and going, oh, I'm sorry, you should say, wait a minute here. I have a stake in your marriage because you're my friend, and I care about you. Or we have a stake in our community in your marriage because you're role models to us. We care about your being together. What can I do to help you work this through? And if more people would just step forward and not accept these non-committal kinds of excuses, then maybe we could save some more marriages and restore happiness. Because in 2/3 or 3/4, depending on the study you see, of cases where couples do stick it out, they say 5 years after describing themselves as unhappy, they say they're happy or very happy in their marriage. So there is hope for people who can stay even in pain and get through this patch and come out on the other side. They're most likely to be happy at the end.
Again, there are people in divorce court every day that are going through issues or giving up on issues that other couples have decided to work through and, as you said, eventually find happiness on the other side. That kind of brings us to one of the chapters, Do Your Duty or Follow Your Heart. You're talking about the attitude we need to have. And there was a time, if you look at the builder generation, those born before the end of World War II, and compare them maybe to the boomer generation, those born between 1946 and 1964, the previous generation had this idea that we will stay together because you do your duty. We're committed. Marriage is a covenant. Marriage is something that is important for us, for the family, for the society, and for our kids. But then when you have, as you said, the change of attitudes that says, well, you just follow your heart, do what you think is right, we need to come back to this idea of the duty that you have to have a strong marriage and to be a pillar of society.
That's true, and that's also coexistent with the change from caring about other people and a broader purpose to being more selfish, self-focused. People now, it's iPhone, it's my this and my that.
Yes.
And you see this everywhere. It's reinforced that it's all about you. Well, the greatest generation knew it's not all about you. It's all about a greater cause and a greater purpose and a greater reason to live than just your moment-to-moment feelings. So if people get together in a marriage and they say, well, we will love each other and live together as long as our love shall last, what kind of prognosis do they have compared to the couple who stands at an altar and says to their family and to God, we are going to be part of this community and we have a long-term view? So that is the difference. It's the short-term versus the long-term. It's the feelings right now versus seeing something noble and important in your life and what you're trying to accomplish.
Again, just before we let you go, let me mention that we have a link to your website, and it is DianeMedved.com. Talk for just a minute about what's available there, because there might be some other individuals that not only want to get a copy of the book, but would like to contact you, find out about some of the previous books that you've talked about, get an audio copy, or anything else. So what will they find when they land on your website?
Well, thank you. I have some articles that I've written, some blog posts, but I do want to emphasize that I did record the audio book, word for word. It is unabridged. It is me reading my book, and at times while I was reading, boy, that was a marathon, and I would get emotional over it, and this book means something to me because I think about the people out there who are hurting in their marriages, and I want to give them courage, and I want them to see that if they can stick this out and be committed to their marriage, that they can survive and thrive. And they can save their children from so much heartache, and they can save their families and so many people around them. So at my website, I do sell my audio book for anyone who has a long commute or even a short one.
Sure.
As well as you said, my other books and some other writings that I talk about. For example, I have a blog post about the fact my husband and I just became grandparents. Our son and his wife had their little girl on January 3rd. And we are so delighted to have her not only near us, but they're living with us now while they remodel their house. So the joys of being a grandparent, many people who are married, they may be in pain right now, but if they look ahead and say, my gosh, I'm denying myself sharing this with my partner, then that can be a motivator to get through a lot of their problems.
Well, just again, as a new grandparent myself, I can appreciate that. So again, just great material. This book, one more time, Don't Divorce, Powerful Arguments for Saving and Revitalizing Your Marriage, written by Dr. Diane Medved, published by Regnery. Look for it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to our website. Thank you for joining us. Say hello to Michael. We've always enjoyed him on the program, and I have certainly enjoyed our time with you today.
Thank you, Kerby.
Let's take a break. Tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition, and so we'll have a round table. Penna Dexter and Debbie Georgiadis for sure will be a part of that, and we'll be getting into some of the issues in the news. If you would also like to know a little bit more about some of the topics we have addressed in these last 2 hours, you can go to the website, pointofview.net, and find out about the books and about the individuals that we've had on the program. And let me also encourage you to maybe read my commentary today, the Viewpoints commentaries on gun-free zones, a topic that I think is going to surface again and again here, and I give you some of the facts and figures and statistics to consider. And as I've mentioned a few times already, take the time and consider what you might do to support this ministry. The first hour we talked about the myth of Jesus, that how to answer that, and the idea that maybe these ideas were borrowed from pagan myths. This hour we've talked about divorce. So whether it's theological issues, family issues, we really want to equip you, empower you, and make you available to make a difference in society. So visit the website, pointofview.net. Click on that button that says Join the Truth Team. Any size gift would be greatly appreciated. I want to thank Andrew and Doug and Catherine and Shamila for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow for our Friday weekend edition.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point Dallas 75 The View Ministries.
families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.